Hello there and welcome to the Inside Health podcast with me, James Gallagher. How are you feeling? I don't know about you, but it seems like there's a cough or a cold or COVID lurking round every corner. They've even been trying their best to stop this pod. I caught COVID the week before Christmas.
I'm recovering from a cold, but not COVID. But
Sorry, my throat's... Say when you're good.
Good. Sorry, James.
Oh, but never fear, the Inside Health team and our guests have all managed to battle through their own viral onslaughts. So we'll be exploring concerns about people buying antibiotics over the internet and whether the drug ketamine can be used to treat alcoholism. I can feel my voice going again, can you hear it? But first, let's turn to what's happening with infections because it seems like there's an unusual abundance. Then we've got some, like Strep A, which are striking outside of their normal season. And don't forget COVID. Who could forget COVID? Because there's a new form to grapple with, as well as implications of China flipping from strict lockdowns to letting the virus spread. So with so much to digest, who better to chat to than immunologist Professor Eleanor Riley from the University of Edinburgh. Eleanor, welcome back to Inside Health.
Thank you very much.
So I think you know, Eleanor, but since the last time I saw you, which was conveniently at a Christmas party, I've caught COVID. It finally happened.
It was bound to happen, wasn't it?
Well, I did briefly like the idea that maybe I was special, but I think it just realised I was lucky for 3 years.
Yeah, me too. I still haven't had it, at least as far as I know.
Do we all have to accept that it is inevitable if we're not there yet?
I think so. I think there is so much of it around now that you really can't avoid it. Apart from becoming a hermit, I don't think you can avoid it. But everybody's experience of getting it is so different.
Now, is there anything to be worried about in this new variant that's cropped up, which is creating lots of headlines, XXB 1.5, dangerous?
As far as I know, and I have not been following this as closely as some people, it's no more dangerous in as much as if you catch it, you're probably not going to get severely ill. There's no evidence that it's evading the ability of vaccines to protect against very severe disease. But that's not to say you might feel quite poorly if you do catch it. What does seem to be the case is it does seem to be much more infectious. And so it is going to spread very quickly. I think it's quite likely to give rise to a kind of winter, early spring peak of infections in the UK across Europe, for example. It's already 40% of isolates in the US. But it's not that different from what's been around before. It's still a subvariant of Omicron. It's just a little bit better at getting round the antibodies that most of us now have.
Why do we give so much attention to new variants of coronavirus? Because I'm just trying to imagine a world where we reported new variants of flu and we have to change the flu vaccine every single year. If we kind of like reported those in the same way, kind of like it'd be terrifying every winter.
It would, although in fact, when flu viruses change, they can be radically different from year to year. And those differences are relevant in terms of our ability to cope with them. So in many ways, we should be actually a lot more worried about new strains of flu than new strains of coronavirus. But perhaps a better example for COVID is to think of the other human coronaviruses, which are one of the causes of the common cold. So there are 4 human coronaviruses that are endemic across the world. And they give us nasty colds in the winter, wherever we happen to be. And they do change subtly over time. They drift, as we say, a genetic drift, where they gather a few mutations here and there, which just gives them a little bit of an edge to avoid any antibodies that we might have from prior infections with those viruses. And that's why we get common colds year after year after year, and some of them are quite nasty, and they're probably the ones caused by coronaviruses. And in many ways, it might be better to think of the COVID virus as becoming another endemic human coronavirus that's going to give us nasty colds in the winter and will slightly change over time, meaning it can reinfect us, but probably won't cause severe disease in very many of us.
One thing that has really been discussed a lot is the impact of China opening up on new variants. Because obviously, you know, they had their zero COVID strategy for most of the pandemic. Now, significant spread of the virus. How big a risk to the rest of the world is that?
I think the reason that people are concerned is that there's been very, very little coronavirus circulating in China for the last 3 years. You have a population, which is 1 in 10 of the world population, that is pretty much non-immune. So all of a sudden, we've got the virus spreading through a naive population, and therefore the potential for a new variant to emerge that's significantly different from the ones that we've seen before is there, because there will be a lot of infections and there will be a lot of high density, so people with lots of virus changing and mutating in a non-immune population. So it could go through an evolutionary process similar to what we saw in the rest of the world in 2020 and 2021. What we don't know is what the outcome of that process will be. The likelihood is that what eventually emerges out of China, if anything, doesn't look that different from anything we've seen before. But there is, I think, a low possibility that something more dangerous might emerge. I'm not personally worried about it, but I don't think we can rule it out.
Can I ask you about something completely different? Because just observing the last year and a bit, when it comes to a whole range of infections, things just seem a little bit out of place. And I was just wondering if you'd noticed the same thing too. So we've had huge numbers of strep A this kind of like autumn and winter, when that's normally an infection, a bacterial infection that is more of a spring-summer kind of thing. We had RSV, that virus that attacks and puts lots of very young children in hospital. That became a summer thing and kind of like well into autumn. Flu arrived earlier than it normally does, and everything just seems a little bit up in the air.
Yes, and I think that's because we disrupted those normal seasonal patterns for well over 2 years. And as those infections are now starting to circulate again, now we're all mixing and moving around much more. Those pathogens have encountered populations, particularly of children, who don't have the levels of immunity that they would otherwise have had. So normally children will become exposed to strep A and RSV, either from their parents or when they start mixing with other children, going to playgroups, going to nursery, that kind of thing. And so by the time they are 2, 3, 4 years old, they've seen all of these things before. We now have a cohort of 2 and 3 year olds who really didn't have that experience. And so as they start to mix, then you've got people who are carrying those infections and a vulnerable population.
Just so that I'm clear then, Eleanor, there's so many vulnerable people just because they haven't caught it in the last couple of years during the pandemic that they can catch it at any time of year and it can take off.
Yes, so the virus or the bacteria isn't spreading optimally in spring and in summer, autumn. It spreads much more easily in winter, but it spreads. If you take together the potential for it to spread not very efficiently, but a bigger population of people who are vulnerable to being infected, it can still get a foothold.
And is there also a danger that there'll be a lot more people getting infected as well? Because if you've got, say, 3 years worth of people that didn't, or 3 school years worth of children that didn't catch bugs during the pandemic, are they all going to get it over the next 12 months? Is this like the worst 12 months for...
They won't all get it, but a lot of them will. So I think we'll probably see the biggest peak this year. But I think we'll probably see a few more than usual next winter and a few more again the following winter before it settles down. And then by the time we get back to children who were born in 2022, 23, they will have a relatively, supposedly normal experience of being exposed to different infections. And then I think we'll see those seasonal patterns reestablished.
Lots of sniffly noses for a few years then?
I think so, yes.
Does it matter if people are getting those infections a little bit later than normal? Say if you get something when you're 6 instead of when you're 3, does that make a difference?
It does for some infections. And so we are seeing a little bit of this delayed infection in children, leading to slightly different presentations, possibly more severe. It may explain why we've seen a little bit more scarlet fever this year, because we're seeing it in slightly older children who maybe weren't exposed to strep A during the pandemic, so they didn't develop the immunity then, and they're getting exposed now. It's one of those things that we can kind of see, but we don't really understand why it's happening.
Ellen, when I'm talking to you, I just sit here mulling on whether we've all changed because of the pandemic as well. Because obviously we've all been through a lot. We're a lot more aware of infections. So I'm just wondering, can we even trust our own perceptions at the moment about how ill we are? Because everyone seems to be ill.
I think there are two slightly different things going on. One is, for some infections, there's definitely more of them about, and they may be slightly out of season. But the other thing that's happening is we're all very, very aware now of infectious diseases. And so when we hear reports of, very sadly, children dying of strep A infections, we kind of think that that's unusual and we haven't heard about it before, and we should therefore be very worried. But at the same time, it's very important to focus on the numbers and say, are there genuinely more cases, more deaths, more of this infection around? Or is it that we're just more attuned to it, more aware of it? And it's only at the end of this winter season, when we're able to look at the data over the past 12 months, that we'll really know how much more RSV, how much more flu.
Just for clarity, Eleanor, you very much pitched all of this as being a consequence of not catching infections during the pandemic because of all the restrictions, all the things we did to control COVID, basically knocked a load of other infections on the head too. But some people out there make a very different argument, and that COVID virus itself has in some way ravaged people's immune systems, and now they can't cope with the same old infections.
We don't have any evidence that that's the case. The way I would tend to view it is not that our immune systems are damaged, but our immune system's a little bit out of date. So in a normal environment, a normal year, all of us are exposed to a whole bunch of infections all the time, most of which we're not even aware of. Our immune system says, oh, yeah, seen you before, deals with it. You don't get sick. You don't notice. You might pass it on to somebody else. You will never know. But that process of being exposed to an infection and dealing with it also boosts your immunity to that infection. It sort of tops you up. And what we haven't had, any of us really, during the period of the major lockdowns, was that normal topping up of our immunity. So it's almost as though our immune system's running on empty a little bit, and we need to top it up, to refuel it by being exposed to infections. And so many of us will get a slightly worse cold or a slightly more severe flu episode because we haven't seen these infections for 2 or 3 years. But once we've seen them once, we'll be well topped up, and then we should be able to cope.
Wow, Eleanor, what a lovely thought for 2023 that was. Thank you for coming on.
God willing.
Professor Eleanor Riley there. Sounds like I should be bracing myself for plenty of coughs and sniffles in the months ahead. I should probably stockpile some tissues as well. But should I be stockpiling other drugs? I mean, there was a survey in the papers this month suggesting people were performing DIY medicine as they were struggling to get hold of a GP. And worryingly, this included buying drugs over the internet. Now, this really struck a chord with me because it was only a few weeks ago that I was chatting to a scientist and they went, James, you will never believe how easy it is to buy antibiotics over the internet. Now, let's be clear, that's really not a good thing. And they were concerned that this practice was contributing to the rise of superbugs that resist treatment. So I invited him in.
Hi, my name is Professor Timothy Walsh. I'm a member of the INEOS Oxford Institute of Antimicrobial Research based at the University of Oxford.
Tim, thank you so much for coming into the studio. Welcome to Inside Health.
Thank you.
So you're here to help us do something that we really shouldn't do, and we're going to get as far as we can without actually buying any, but we are going to go looking online for antibiotics, aren't we? So walk me through it.
Simply type into a search engine, type in online antibiotics for sale.
Online antibiotics for sale.
How many hits actually did you get for that?
That's only the 10 million results.
10 million, okay. You have your choice. Why not this one? Bioamoxicillin, prescription included, maybe not. Why don't we go for this one? Ampicillin, 500 mg, capsules.
Okay, 500 milligrams of amoxicillin.
Okay, away you go.
Right, now, I'm not speaking to a doctor here, am I? Or anything? Right. That's 9 pence. Okay, so I have to say whether I have a private prescription, an NHS prescription or not. This one says I have to post my prescription.
Oh, that's quite good, though.
Shall we pick a different one?
So, ciprofloxacin.
Okay. 30 tablets. Add to basket. So I'd have to create an account, but go on, let's do that really quickly.
So the UK ones, you have to show a prescription, which doesn't make an awful lot of sense. Why would you do that when you could go to your chemist or pharmacy? We're there, are we?
Right, Timothy, I've created my account from a seemingly US-based website. It's all charged in dollars anyway.
I don't know where they are actually based, although they're charging us in US dollars. It's
So that's 30 cents for 30
250
tablets.
mgs, aren't they? 250 milligram tablets.
Is that cheap?
Very.
Check out. Oh, I had my shipping address.
But they do have to send them somewhere.
Yeah, it's fair. It's fair.
Are we good?
I think we're good. So, I'm basically, by the looks of it, one button away from ordering them. Just to be clear, I'm not going to place an order.
Okay, and that's US dollars.
It's 30 quid in sterling once they convert it. Because I'm paying $20 US worth of shipping
Are you?
charges.
Does it say where it's being shipped from?
It doesn't. Medication orders are filled and shipped from approved fulfillment centres around the world, including but not limited to India, the UK, New Zealand, Mauritius and the United States.
Well, that's a selection of countries.
How easy was that?
Well, it was very easy. It's easy to do. I think the problem that we have fundamentally is that we have no idea of the scale of this. When we looked at UK sites, there were hurdles to go through where you had to show your prescription or upload it, etc. But certainly for 99.99% of the sites out there, you can clearly, as you have done, bought online without any prescription.
Now, we're not advocating doing this. We should be clear about that. The point was just to demonstrate how easy it is.
Yes.
Why is it a problem?
Well, there's several problems with that. On a personal level, we don't actually know whether the person actually needs antibiotics. So whether they've got an upper respiratory tract infection or whether they've got gastroenteritis, we don't know whether it's bacterial or whether it's viral. And in this,
antibiotics only work if it's a bacterial infection.
Exactly. And therefore, in this country, it's probably viral more than bacterial. Not necessarily so, but probably. Secondly is that they will be then taking the antibiotics unnecessarily. And therefore, they will be exposing the bacteria that's part of their normal flora, because we have bacteria in us and on the outside of us, and those bacteria will be exposed to the antibiotic. And so therefore resistance can develop, and the resistant bacteria, if there are any, can then outgrow the sensitive bacteria. This is a real problem on a personal level, but on a kind of community level, if this continues to happen, obviously bacteria can be disseminated by the bacteria that's part of our normal flora and spread via fecal contamination. Again, not a huge problem in this country because we have good tertiary sewage systems that sort of prevent that. But in many countries, that simply doesn't exist.
So you're in a world where whenever you use antibiotics, you're creating the opportunity for basically superbugs to develop, which can then spread.
Yes, absolutely. And whilst that's a continued pressure for the resistant bacteria to survive and then grow and outcompete the sensitive ones, we will never kind of arrest the problem. And the internet sales of antibiotics simply magnifies that on an unbelievable scale. The other thing to note too is that, for example, if you were to order, you're not going to, but if you were to order ciprofloxacin, that bacteria may be resistant to ciprofloxacin, but it will also be resistant to lots of other antibiotics that are unrelated to ciprofloxacin. So you'll be driving populations of the ciprofloxacin-resistant bacteria that's also resistant to other antibiotics. So no antibiotic that is used inappropriately or unnecessarily is a good idea.
What do we do about this? We've presented the problem. What's the solution here?
Well, there's not an awful lot we can do.
This is the internet.
Yeah, this is the internet. It's very difficult to rein back on that. All we can do is to educate individuals and to say, look, this is actually really not a good thing. I think there is a responsibility with search engines to have social responsibility and global accountability with this problem. But the fact of the matter is this is the huge part of the iceberg underneath the waterline that we simply don't see. So whilst we look at various countries and can collect antimicrobial consumption or usage data, and we might be able to do that in hospitals, good, and we might try and limit it within hospitals, good, but we get very, very little data out in the community, and that's the data that we know where pharmacies would provide that information. But, this is information that we simply have no idea how enormous it is, and it's probably huge.
Do we have no estimate at all?
No.
So it could be huge or it could be nothing, and we just don't know.
Well, clearly it's not nothing, because when we put in search for this, you got 10 million hits.
Yeah.
Therefore, there are potentially 10, and that was antibiotics online ordering or sales. Therefore, that's an underestimation, because clearly that's where the ceiling is. So therefore, there's almost certainly at least 10 million possibilities out there where people can buy online antibiotics. Therefore, it's not zero.
Tim, thank you so much for coming in.
Pleasure.
So, don't go buying antibiotics online. And if that wasn't enough, then listen to what the Royal Pharmaceutical Society has to say.
Any website that provides a prescription-only medicine without a prescription is acting illegally. If a website supplies medicines illegally, the site may also not be following the rules in other ways. For example, it could be supplying fake or substandard medicines. Regarding the purchaser, we cannot definitely say whether a person buying a medicine that way is acting illegally, but we would advise against it in the strongest terms.
Now, I'm not even going to try buying ketamine online. I'll probably have the police bang on the studio door before we even finish recording here. But we are going to talk about it because ketamine, while already being used in medicine, has some new exciting implications, because researchers think the way that it alters the brain could be used to help treat alcohol addiction. It's fascinating. So I caught up with Celia Morgan, who's a professor of psychopharmacology at the University of Exeter. Celia, welcome to Inside Health.
Wow, thanks, James.
How radical is this idea of using ketamine in treating alcoholism?
Well, I think it does represent a bit of a paradigm shift in the way we treat addiction, because we're not just using ketamine, we're using ketamine really as a catalyst for psychological therapy. And what we've shown in our phase 2, so our early clinical trial, is that giving this quite brief combination treatment can produce really long-lasting changes in drinking behaviour in quite severely alcoholic patients.
So how big a difference were you noticing in kind of like, I appreciate it's early stage stuff, but how big a difference are you noticing so far?
So we had 4 groups. We gave ketamine with and without therapy, and then placebo with and without therapy. And we found the strongest effects in the group given ketamine and therapy. And they were at 6 months, 86% of them were abstinent from alcohol. That compares to about 30% in a treatment as usual population. So it's really substantial effect, really.
That's huge.
Yeah, we were happy with it. That was an early stage trial, so that's why we're now embarking on this kind of huge study to try and find the definitive evidence so we can roll this treatment out on the NHS.
And what's the idea of what adding in ketamine, which is an illegal drug to take recreationally in the UK, what's the idea of that? What is it doing in the brain that helps alongside therapy?
The preclinical, so the animal evidence suggests that ketamine has these downstream effects on a process known as neuroplasticity. So it makes the brain more able to learn new things and make new connections. This peaks about 24 hours following a dose of ketamine. So that's when we time one of our long therapy sessions, because we think this kind of combination approach with therapy, what we're asking people to do in psychological therapy is to learn new approaches to thinking about old problems. So we try and use the two in combination. And that's why we consider ketamine to be this kind of catalyst for therapy.
So it's kind of warming up the brain to be ready for the therapy.
Yeah, warming up the brain to be ready to learn new things and take a new perspective on one's life. I think with particularly alcohol problems, people get very stuck in a rut. They can't really see a way out of it. And so ketamine seems to facilitate that in combination with therapy. Also, the subjective effects of the drug are quite unusual. You know, people feel like they're floating outside of their bodies. They actually see themselves from a different perspective. And I think that's kind of psychologically is helpful too.
Is it okay to use ketamine? And I'm sure there are plenty of people listening going, okay.
Ketamine is used as a recreational drug, but it's a Schedule 2 drug. So it's used throughout hospitals around the world every day. It's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, one of the most important anesthetics in the world. So it is used medically. I do think there's a potential for abuse with it. And I've actually done quite a lot of research in the early part of my career looking at people who take recreational ketamine and become very heavy users. But we know to see the kind of problems with ketamine, people need to be taking the drug very frequently, daily, really, to see some of the changes that are most dramatic with it. So what we give here is really just 3 infusions of ketamine embedded in a psychological therapy program that's designed to tackle addiction. And we think that sort of de-risks it in that sense. Obviously, it's something we're looking out for in all of our trials. And I certainly wouldn't want to diminish, ketamine problems. They can be significant for some people, but we haven't observed it so far. So we feel the kind of cost-benefit ratio is in favour of giving it in this case, because alcohol does have some really negative impacts on not just people's lives, but all the people around them.
So is there any danger of people listening to something like this or reading any of your studies or any of the coverage around them and then trying to do this on their own?
Well, what we emphasise here, the ketamine is a catalyst for the therapy, and doesn't work as a drug on its own. That's what we found from our trial result. And so really, people wouldn't be able to conduct that kind of therapy at home on their own. And it's just 3 doses of ketamine that we give to facilitate 7 very long sessions of psychological therapy. So I hope the message would be that it's this combination treatment and not something we would encourage anyone to try at home. And you wouldn't get the effects that we get in these really carefully controlled clinical conditions.
How big a need is there for better treatments in alcoholism?
I think the need's pretty huge, of people who detox from alcohol and then go through treatment. We know 3 out of 4 of them will be back drinking after a year. There is a dramatic need for new treatments and they aren't really emerging, I think. And that's why this is exciting to me, is that it's a completely new way of treating alcohol problems. So it provides a hope really for people who may have lost hope and have tried everything else.
And do the benefits last in the very long term? Or how long do we know so far that they do work?
We've only followed people up to 6 months in the first study, and that was a small study. 96 people were involved. This larger study, we're following up 280 people, and the main outcomes will be at 6 months, but we're following up half of them to 12 months. And that's because running clinical trials is incredibly costly, and this is being funded mainly by the Department for Health. I could certainly say, anecdotally, people get in touch with me over email often and say, I'm still sober today, thanks to the trial, that they did 3 years ago. And it's an amazing privilege to be involved and to be helping people in that way.
Celia, it feels like we're on the cusp of something. Fingers crossed for the next trials, and hopefully it all comes together.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I mean, it will be quite a while till we actually have the results. So around 3 years. Clinical trials are not for the impatient.
Professor Celia Morgan there. And we're nearly done for this Inside Health, but before we go, I do need to ask you all for a favour, because later in the series we're going to take a look at back pain, and I want to hear from you. What have your experiences been like? What worked for you in terms of treatment? What nagging questions do you still have? Let the team know at insidehealth@bbc.co.uk, or you can tweet me at James T. Gallagher. So thank you for listening to the Inside Health podcast with me, James Gallagher. The producer was Geraldine Fitzgerald, and the studio manager, Sarah Hockley. See you next time when I'll be at a maggot farm. Yeah, you heard that right. A maggot farm.